What's up, guys? It's Mitch here from the DIYRecordingStudio.com, and today we're going to be doing the second part in our EQ basics, where we have a look at two of the basic rules to beginning to use EQ. And we looked at the first one not too long ago. I'll put the link to the video right here or down below, and you should check that out. If you haven't watched that video already, it's probably a good starting point. But basically what we went over was my first rule to great EQ, which is that you should cut your unwanted frequencies before you boost the frequencies that you want to hear. Basically, it's just good practice to remove frequencies from the mix that are going to cause problems rather than start with boosting frequencies. It's a common mistake that beginning engineers make. They're very quick usually to go and just boost frequencies because we hear those and it sounds nice, but what we're not realizing is there's a whole heap of frequencies we should probably be taking out of the mix first. And therefore you can create space in your mix, and you get more space for other instruments. So we looked at that last week, and today we're going to look at the second part to that rule, which is cutting frequencies on a narrow Q and boosting frequencies wide. So you cut them with a narrow Q, but then boost wide. And the reason why that is a general rule is because basically when we cut narrow, you don't hear it. It's a really simple kind of idea, but basically the way human hearing works is that if we cut with a narrow Q or a narrow bandwidth, we just don't perceive it as much. And so when you're cutting frequencies, it's good practice to cut with a narrow Q. That way you're getting rid of those unwanted frequencies, but you're not leaving that instrument or track sounding empty. So it's a common mistake again from beginning artists when we first start out, that we start boosting with narrow Qs because we can hear them, and we cut with wider Qs because we can hear what we're getting rid of. But actually what you're doing is messing up the harmonic content, and you're doing some funny things potentially with comb filtering and all these kind of phasey kind of things, and it's really not what you want to be doing. So today we're going to have a look at why it is good practice to cut narrow and boost wide. So we're going to get back into our track that we're working on last session, which was Naturally by Alan Stone. It's a recording from the Telefunken Live at the Lab sessions. I'll put a link to that down below. Those sessions are incredible. I spoke about them last video. They're some of the best recorded sessions you ever get stems for. They're a great starting point for any engineer to just sort of have a listen to what really good tracking with good mics and good preamps sounds like, and what you should be aiming to achieve in your tracking sessions. And then when you achieve those good tracking sessions, you can then obviously achieve a better mix. But that's for another time, so we might get into that another session. But these tracks are amazing, so definitely go check those out. So let's dive into our Cubase session. And if you're using another DAW, obviously you can apply all of these to your own respective DAWs. Let's jump into it. So last time we were mucking around with some EQs. We were using the SSL channel strip to remove some frequencies, and I'll just reset some of these things because I've been mucking around with them. Okay, let's go there. But last time we basically looked at removing frequencies. So let's have a quick look at that. So here's our kick drum soloed. And what we basically did was put a low frequency roll off on everything that has a microphone, basically just to get rid of anything that's rumbling down there. Doesn't have to be drastic, just something little. And now when you listen to this kick drum, it's a good recording, but there's these boxy frequencies that are typical to a kick drum sound. And basically, it's a good practice to try and get rid of those, because there's other instruments that are going to be having fundamental frequencies or natural occurring frequencies in that frequency range. So Basically, I would describe the sound as boxy, and that boxy sound usually occurs in the low mids. Let's have another listen to it. Now, if I say low mids, I'm talking between, you know, sort of 3 to 700, maybe 800 hertz. But what we want to do is locate those real problems in those low mids and find exactly where it is. Because if we're going to cut narrow, we need to find the exact point that those boxy frequencies are happening. So the way you do that is boost with a narrow EQ first. So I'm going to create an EQ with a narrower sort of Q there. Okay, it's narrower. That's pretty narrow. And what I'm going to do is boost it, and then we're going to use the sweep method. So what you do is basically sweep the frequency across those low mids until you find those boxier frequencies that you want to probably get rid of, and then you pull them out. So let's have a look. It's pretty boxy there, 350. And around those 400 mark too. But I would say, particularly there, it's quite nasty. So let's dip that out. There we go. We can already hear how much cleaner that is. And that's an 11 dB cut. Let's have a listen. Without the cut. With the cut. With. Instantly sounds cleaner. Now that's cool. That's what we can do to remove those frequencies, and that's what we call subtractive EQ, and that's what we were looking at last video, is basically removing those frequencies that you don't want in the mix. And if we use that narrow Q, it's going to sound quite nice. Let's have a look at what happens if we accidentally use a wider Q on this. Now on its own, that might sound okay, but let's have a listen in the mix, because the most important part of EQing is that you don't EQ just soloed. It's fine to sort of find the frequencies you want to work with when you solo it, but you always should add the track back into the mix and listen to what you've done in the context of the mix. Let's have a listen. And you're just the way that you move. And the kick has disappeared. The kick has totally disappeared. We're cutting way too wide a queue of frequencies there. Let's dial it back a bit. Yet you're beautiful. Around the neck. There it is. Don't let up. Disrespect, disrespect, disrespect. Let's go back wider. Popping pills and posting pics, stressing on the waist and hips. The body's right, the world is sick, world is sick, world is sick. So you can hear as soon as we get too wide, we start losing that kick drum in the mix, and it's really not what we want. So that's probably the best example I can show you right now with the kick drum on why we cut narrow. Now, there's also the antithesis to that, which is boosting wide. So we cut narrow, boost wide. And the reason why we boost wide is because, once again, it sounds more natural to us. And it's a little bit more transparent. We don't notice that that's what we're doing. But, you know, we'll give a good example of that as well. So when we're boosting a frequency, what you want to do is find the fundamental frequencies of that instrument. Typically, that's a good starting point. So on a kick drum, there's two fundamental frequencies. The first fundamental frequency on any drum is the lower frequency range and the resonance of the drum. Basically the shell of the drum and the skins vibrating create this low resonance, and each drum has its own fundamental, but on a kick drum you're probably going to find it's around 50 to 100 hertz, and that's the fundamental. So let's have a look at that. There's 50 hertz, and then 100 hertz. 50, 100. And basically the difference between 50 and 100 is that 50 hertz is going to give you that much lower, subbier, oomphy, thumpy kind of vibe going on. And then 100 hertz is going to give you a lot more punch. It's typically what we call the punchy part of the drum kit, so of the kick drum. So it just depends what you want. Do you want a punchier kick drum? Are you doing something with rock or something where you want real punch in there? Or are you doing something where you want that kick drum to sit a little bit lower in the mix and have that just that low thumpiness to it? So it's more to taste in this regards. But let's have a look at this concept of what happens when we boost with a narrow Q. So let's have a listen just soloed for now. So we've got a nice wide Q. I'm going to pick around this sort of, I think around 50 hertz is pretty good on this kick drum. Sounds nice. Now I'm going to narrow that Q. Now with that narrower Q, it's starting to sound a bit pokey, what I would call pokey. It's really focused. And on the context, on its own, soloed, it probably doesn't sound that bad. Let's have a listen. You know, it's okay, it's sounding there, but there's something funny going on. But let's once again go back to listening to it in the context of the mix. Good to me, and you're just the way that you should be. Now we're starting to once again lose kind of the real focus of the kick drum. There's this pokey low end, but it doesn't sound full. I wouldn't say that this sounds full, like there's a full low end to it. Have another listen. Yet you're beautiful, can't be news around the neck. Now, let's try widening that Q a little more. Disrespect, popping pills and posting pics, stressing on the waist and hips. There we go, now we're starting to get somewhere. So basically, we widen that Q and that low end just sounds smoother. Have another listen. The world is sick, world is sick, world is sick from flower to flower, growing free. Oh, your petals, they look good. The kick drum sounds nice, but let's go back to that narrower Q. Let's have a listen again. Sounds a bit empty. Let's go back to that wider Q. Instantly the kick drum with that wider Q is sitting alongside the bass in a much nicer way. I think it's quite obvious. It almost sounds like with that narrower Q, things just sound a bit gutted or a bit empty, or there's just something weird going on with those low frequencies. So this is why we stick to those rules of boosting wide. And typically I would even boost maybe not with a bell curve, but with a shelf, and then use that low, that high pass filter there, or that low cut, to then trim that, that shelf down. So I'm going to go to a low shelf like this. And it looks like there's something crazy going on, but it's actually going to roll off with that. We're still actually tapering off on this low cut here. You can see it in the frequency response. The world is sick, world is sick, world is sick from flower to flower. If I want a bit more punch, I can drag that back. Growing free. we're just getting this much more natural sound that's working within the natural harmonic range of that kick drum, because there is this low bump that naturally happens across that frequency range. So we're just going to keep working within that. The microphone has already done the job of picking out the frequencies that we want. They're there. I think the way of thinking of it is the microphone has done what it needs to do to capture that sound. There's just some things we need to sculpt. Okay, so EQing is kind of this idea of sculpting stuff. So we've got that low end frequency thing happening, but there's also one other fundamental when it comes to drums. And the way to think of the second fundamental is that when you hit a drum, be it with a stick or with the beater of the kick drum, you're getting this attack of the beater or the stick hitting the skins, and that creates a higher frequency attack that we also perceive. So basically, you've got that low resonance that comes from the drum itself and the skins vibrating, but you also have that attack. And that is usually located up in the high frequencies, usually somewhere around 4 to 5 kilohertz. But let's once again use our sweeping technique to find the frequency that we're looking to boost in the kick drum. So I'm going to activate this high parametric. Okay, I'm going to narrow the Q just a little bit to find it. Here we go. And while I'm boosting it quite aggressively, you can really hear the attack of that beater. So let's have a listen to that. Yet you're beautiful, calorie news around the neck. Don't let up, disrespect. So instantly we have more attack, more front end on that kick drum. We've got that nice low end going here. Listen here. Respect, disrespect. And now we have more beater. Now, once again, how much beater you want to add into that is all to taste. On something like metal, you might really want to push that beater sound. But this is kind of a mellower, neo-soul-y kind of vibe. So we probably, or R&B kind of vibe. So we probably don't want too much beater in that mix. But just for the sake of what we're talking about today, let's have a listen to what it sounds like with a narrow Q. So I'm going to solo it first. Now, when we've used the narrow Q on high frequencies, I think it becomes more apparent what's happening with those narrow Qs when we boost. We start to hear these weird phase relationships starting to develop in the spill and stuff like that. You start to hear this weird phasey kind of thing going on, and there's these weird harmonics happening, and it just doesn't sound right. Have another listen. And all of that is going to translate into your mix. So let's have a listen once again in the context of the mix. Once again, it's quite pokey, like it's really obvious that something's being boosted, but not really in a pleasant way, not in the kind of way we probably want. So, how do we fix that? Well, let's try and boost with a much wider Q. And let's see how that sounds. And what you'll notice is I can actually drag the gain down on that EQ because it becomes a lot, like just too much. It's poking through a lot. But with that wider Q, it's going to sit in the mix a lot nicer. Have another listen. Disrespect, disrespect, disrespect. Soloed. Sounds much more narrow, much more natural, I should say. Not narrow. But yeah, it sounds much more natural. And we could even go a step further, and instead of using a bell curve again, we could use a shelf. So I might try using this shelf, see how that sounds.
World is sick, world is sick from flower to flower, growing free. Oh, your petals, they look good to me.
Maybe I'll just use a wide cue.
You're just the way that you move should be, yet you're beautiful. Gallery news around.
I definitely like the shelf more. So let's solo it and have a listen, because this is what most people usually make a mistake with. They'll solo stuff and they go, yeah, that sounds good. Sure. Oh, I can really hear the beater there. So then they might go, all right, well, that sounds a bit more focused. Maybe that sounds better. But once we get into the context of the mix, I feel like the shelf sounds a lot nicer. Let's have another listen.
Sick, world is sick, world is sick from flower to flower, growing free. Oh, your petals, they look good.
I think with that shelf, it just sounds more natural in the mix. There's nothing funny going on. With that bell curve, it sounds a bit like an artificial sound. It doesn't sound like a real kick drum to me. But once we add those smoother edges with the shelves, we just get this really natural kick sound in the mix. And that's really what you should be going for. You're not trying to really sculpt the sound too much, because it's been recorded well. The vibe's there. Everything's tracked really nicely. It's just about bringing out those sounds in a natural way and removing those unwanted frequencies. And you can see, like, I've got this very wide curve and with these shelves, and then this nice narrow cue for the removal of the unwanted frequencies in that boxy range. I think it sounds quite good. Let's have a listen soloed.
That you should be, yet you're beautiful. Gallery news around the neck.
Now what we'll do is go into the SSL channel strip, because basically what I want to show is how we can recreate this curvature in the SSL, and basically this Cubase, what we've done in Cubase here is really just recreate what is naturally occurring in a standard EQ like an SSL or any kind of traditional analog piece of gear, because these high shelves and low shelves are already there. That's actually what's part of the sound of an SSL or a Neve or any of those famous EQs, is that they naturally boost wide, and something like an SSL can cut frequencies with a narrow cue. So I'm going to bypass the equalizer on Cubase, get rid of that for a sec. So we're back to our original sort of kick sound, and I'm going to match what we've done in Cubase. So let's start with those frequencies: 345 at 11.4 dB, 350, 340, 11 dB. That's a lot there. It's pretty cool though.
Respect, disrespect, disrespect. Popping pills and posting pics, stressing all.
So we've cut that frequency. Let's we've got our low roll off there and an 80 hertz shelf. So let's go to 80, and we'll boost this by how much? 8.5 dB.
No wasting hips, body's right. The world is sick, world is sick, world is sick from flower to flower, growing free. Oh,
We're getting a little bit too much gain on this input. I'm going to pull it back down a bit.
your petals, they look good.
Just to make sure we're not just turning stuff up and hearing the effects of that. Now, what was the shelf we've got here? 3 kilohertz, 7.5. So what was it again? 3.1, 7.5, 3.1. There we go. And then we'll go 7.5.
To me, and you're just the way that yet you're beautiful. Gallery news around the neck. Don't let up. Disrespect, disrespect, disrespect.
Cool, and I've roughly matched, well, I've pretty closely matched those frequencies, but I think we've got a very different sound coming from that SSL. Let's have a comparison. Mix. So this is the SSL.
The world is sick, world is sick, world is sick from flower to flower, growing.
So it's Cubase going. Back to SSL. I'm just going to try and level match them a bit. I think the SSL is outputting a bit higher, which we don't want. Let's check that.
Yet you're beautiful. Gallery news around the neck. Don't let up. Disrespect, disrespect.
Back to the SSL.
Disrespect. Popping pills and posting pics. Stressing on the waist and hips. My body's right. The world is sick. World is sick. World is sick from flower to flower.
Cool. So we've matched those settings, but the SSL definitely has a very distinct sound. And that's because that SSL plugin is modeled after the real SSL and all the circuitry in that channel strip. Yeah, so basically that SSL sounds quite different to the Cubase EQ. And what we should note is that every EQ has its own sound, be it your DAW stock standard EQ or be it any kind of plugin. And plugins are generally modeled after real bits of hardware that we use in the industry. The SSL is one of the most famous channel strips used. It's a great sounding console in real life, and this solid state logic or SSL channel strip by Waves is one of my favorite. It sounds very much like the real thing, and there's just this character that it imparts when you're using it. So when you EQ with the same settings in Cubase, this SSL is going to impart its own sound and its own flavor across that EQ setting range. So typically how people describe the SSL is it's very transparent, and you can really turn it up a lot and make aggressive cuts and boosts, and you can really sort of sculpt your sound in a really transparent but also aggressive way if you want to. And there's a real low end meatiness to it. Like the low end is really standing out a lot more, I feel, compared to the Cubase EQ. Everything's a little bit more focused, and you know, I think it's just a bit nicer sounding in the mix. Let's have another listen to the comparison. So we'll start with the Cubase EQ. So that's Cubase. Now the SSL. And what I would probably do, I think the SSL sounds a bit punchier, so I might even bring that low shelf down a little bit to make it match the sound that we were aiming for originally. Disrespect, disrespect, disrespect. Popping pills and posting pics, stressing on the waist and hips. Cool, and I think I'm still getting a bit too much output from that, so I'm going to pull it down. The world is sick, world is sick, world is sick from flower to flower, growing free. Oh, your petals, they look good to me, and you're just the way that you... Cool, and I think both sound good, really. I'm actually pretty impressed with the sound of the Cubase EQ. I think the SSL just has a bit more of a vintage vibe to it, and it sits in the mix a bit nicer. But yeah, all of that's to taste. It just depends on what you want to do. And I think the correct way to think about it is that every plugin for EQ and for other plugins as well, like compressors, they all are just a different tool. They all have their own sound, their own character, and they're just a different tool for the same job. And it's like, which is the right tool for you for that job? You might want to use a different EQ on snares or a different EQ on your guitars because those EQs work better on those things. So just keep that in mind. And it's probably something that we'll look at later on in later videos. But typically for drums, and basically, I mean, the SSL channel is very, very versatile. You can use it on anything. It sounds pretty great. If I was going to choose any plugin to start out with, the SSL channel strip is probably where I would start. Cool. So we've done some subtractive and additive EQ on the kick drum, but let's have a look at some of the other instruments. Let's go to the snare drum and see what we can do there.
Moves to a tree, yet you're beautiful. Calorie news around the neck.
Let's have a look at our snare that we grouped last time. All right, so I can see here we've cut frequencies at around, we've cut it around 790 hertz. So what I'm going to do is help visualize that again. Let's go to 790. 790. We'll boost, sweep that frequency for that frequency that's bad that we didn't want. There it is. Pull it out. And probably don't want to pull too much of that out because you're going to remove the fundamentals and the ring out of that. So once again with that cutting, like let's have a look at a narrow cut here versus a wide cut. So narrow. Should probably go a little bit wider. Actually, I think it's a bit lower with this EQ. $560. Yeah, I think around there, around that 570 mark. So let's adjust that to 570. We'll get back to that in a sec. So let's go for a wider cut and see how that sounds. So it sounds like we're getting a bit of a fat snare and getting rid of some of the ring, but now once again, going back to what we did before. Let's listen to it in the context of the whole mix. And our snare's lost again. So let's narrow that cue in the mix.
Disrespect, disrespect, disrespect.
Instantly the snare comes back, and it's more to do with those 200 hertz frequencies being cut out previously with that wider cue.
Popping pills and posting pics, stressing on the waist.
That's with the wide cue.
Body's right, the world
Narrow.
is sick, world is sick, world is sick.
All of the energy of the snare comes back. So with that wider cue, you're just losing all the snare energy. So that's why it's important to cut narrow. Let's put another high pass, get rid of some of that kick spill. Cool. And I think it's pretty obvious where the fundamental of the snare drum is in this, because we can see it poking out around 200. There it is. So what we can do is look for a wide frequency curve that we want to boost in that region. Let's have a listen. You can hear as soon as I boost those frequencies, we start getting more like what I would call meat to the snare. There's much more low end. Have a listen. So without, with. Now, as is important again, and I'm going to keep saying this, we need to listen to it in the context of the mix. Are we actually adding frequencies that we want in the context of the mix? Let's have a listen.
Popping pills and posting pics, stressing on the wasting hips. My body's right, the world is sick.
Now it sounds okay, but I think it's actually adding a bit of boxiness to that frequency range, and it's competing a little bit with the kick and the bass drum. So I might dial that back quite a bit. Maybe I'll leave a little bit in.
World is sick from flower to flower, growing free.
Cool, I think our snare has a lot of body to it now. I might roll off some of the lows a bit more, taper that in a bit.
Oh, your pedals, they look good to me.
There we go. I think that's starting to sound a bit better. I'll dial that back just a tad. But if I really want to focus the snare, the fundamentals of the snare may be down at this 200 of the resonance sort of stuff. But a lot of that snare sound that we want to hear is actually up here in the top frequency ranges. That snare rattle and the attack of the stick on the snare drum is really what you hear in the room when you listen to a snare drum being hit. So let's look at, once again, we'll start with a narrow boost. Let's find the fundamental of the snare drum here. We'll solo it out. Just have a listen. So some stuff there around 2K. Definitely some stuff up here around 5K. Even 10K has some stuff going on. So there's a lot of frequencies where that snare drum has information going on in the top. But if we just choose to boost something with a narrow Q, listen to what happens. Like with the kick drum, we start to get that real pokey, real just narrow, nasally. It just doesn't sound great. There's all these weird phasey, comb filtery things happening. Have another listen. All the overtones become weird and just not sound. They just don't sound right. Let's go down a little bit further. You know, it might sound like you're doing something interesting, but let's once again have a listen in the context of the mix.
You move so sweet, yet you're beautiful. Calorie news around the neck. Don't let up.
So we can hear there that we're boosting some nice fundamentals at 2 kilohertz. Let's go up to 5.
Disrespect, disrespect, disrespect. Popping pills and posting pics.
Now, I really like the sound of those frequencies boosted at around 5 kilohertz, but it sounds too pokey in the mix there. Sounds much too pokey in the mix.
Stressing on the wasting hips.
So once again, let's try adding maybe a shelf or something there. So let's turn that off. Add a shelf. Start at 5 kilohertz and put a nice boost there.
Body's right, the world is sick. World is sick. World is sick from flower to flower, growing free. Oh, your pedals, they look good. And you're just the way that you move should be. Yet you're beautiful. Calorie news around the neck. Don't let up, disrespect.
And I think there's the sweet spot, right around that 3.2 kilohertz mark. We're getting some of the low 2K, like sort of nice fundamental there, but we're also getting all that nice top frequency range in a really nice way that complements the mix rather than fights with it. Have a listen.
Disrespect, disrespect. Popping pills stressing on the waist and hips.
And I might even get rid of that low frequency boost a little bit.
My body's right, the world is sick, world is sick, world is sick from flower to flower, growing free.
Sounds pretty good. And it's working with the rest of the drum kit in the mix. So let's try and recreate that in our SSL EQ again. Alrighty, turn that EQ off. Need a roll off that goes to 56 Hertz. 56. 574. We're going to cut at about 4.3 dB. It's a narrow Q.
Good to me.
Cool. Put a low shelf boost at around 292. Probably going to do that a bit lower on this. Very minimal boost there. 1 dB.
Just the way that you should be.
Now on the SSL EQ, I think immediately that becomes too much with that low end. And that's something that the SSL EQ is known for with its low end. I think even just running it through this EQ, you can hear the low end that it's adding without even actually adding any low end. Listen to it.
Yet you're beautiful, gallery news around the neck.
Like, I really don't think that that needs any more low end. So I might leave that actually. And then let's get this 3.2 kilohertz shelf going. So 3.2 kilohertz.
Don't let up. Disrespect, disrespect, disrespect. Popping pills and posting pics, stressing on the waist and hips. My body's right, the world is sick, world is sick, world is sick from flower to flower, growing free.
Now I really like that. I think on the snare drum, the SSL EQ really stands out. I could probably even, once again, because that SSL EQ is so transparent, I could probably push those highs a little more.
Oh, your pedals, they look good to me.
And we start getting a bit more of that tambourine, but I think it works. I think it sounds pretty good.
Just the way that you push.
So that's it soloed in the mix.
Disrespect, disrespect, disrespect. Popping pills and posting pics, stressing on.
Cool, so let's do a comparison between this SSL EQ and the Cubase EQ.
Sick, world is sick, world is sick from power.
So that's the SSL.
Growing free. Oh, your pedals,
Cubase.
they look good to me. And you're just the way that you should be.
SSL.
Yet you're beautiful, gallery news around the neck. Don't let up. Disrespect, disrespect,
Cubase.
disrespect. Popping pills and posting pics, stressing on the waist and hips.
SSL.
My body's right, the world is sick, world is sick, world is sick from flower to flower, growing free.
Cool, so once again, I think the SSL sounds a bit tighter, a bit punchier, a bit more focused. But I'm impressed with the Cubase EQ as well. It has this big open sort of sound to it. You could go either or. I think the Cubase EQ sounds cleaner, but the SSL has a lot more character to it. I think that's how I would describe the difference. So it just depends on what you're going for. If you wanted a more vintage sound, SSL. If you want a very clean sound, stock plug-in on your DAW. But that's the kick and snare. Let's have a listen just with kick and snare on their own. And I think together, just those two tracks there are sounding great. We're getting those, just that real fatness of the kick, the top end of the snare, and it's really driving the song now. Let's listen in the mix.
And you're just the way that you move should be, yet you're beautiful.
Cool. So that's a good starting point. Let's go back to our overheads that we were working with last week as well. And what we looked at last week was removing those really annoying low mids around the 700 hertz range. There's this real crazy sort of honky airiness that you'll hear down there. I'm going to bypass the SSL once again. We'll match the low roll off we had, which is 263. Let's get that low cut to 263 first. Remove those frequencies. We know we didn't want those. And if we go straight to, where were we at? 680. Let's have a listen. Once again, we'll go back to sweeping for the frequencies we don't want. Narrow Q. So what you can hear when we really focus it and dial it in is not only is there that sort of sound from those cymbals like we talked about last time, but there's also the honkiness of all the other instruments. The snare sounds honky, the toms sound honky. And by removing that in our overheads, we're going to leave the more pleasant fundamentals to complement the other microphones in the mix. So let's take that out. So honky instantly sounds better. Without it, okay, and I think the rule of thumb where we're talking about cutting frequencies on a narrow Q are going to become very obvious if we cut too wide on the overheads. Let's have a listen. If we cut wide there, not that wide, even just this wide, we start losing some fundamentals, and I think once we add this in the mix, we'll really hear it.
The wasting hips, body's right, the world is sick, world is sick, world is sick from power.
And what you should notice is that the snare starts to sound a bit different, and that's because the reinforcement from these overheads being in phase with the snare is now starting to get lost because we're cutting too much of those fundamentals out of the overheads. Let's have another listen in the mix. Our snare sounds a bit emptier, a bit more thin. Now let's just narrow that Q a little bit. Instantly our snare comes back. Instantly we have more snare. Let's listen again.
You're just the way that you move should be, yet you're beautiful. Around the neck.
Snare's a bit lost.
Don't let up. Disrespect, disrespect, disrespect.
All of those fundamentals come back in this range from the snare, and that's being reinforced in the overheads. So you don't want to cut too much out of your overheads ever. We could even dial this back a little bit, probably. Slow frequency. Cut here.
Stressing on the wasting hips.
But I'm really digging that, and because they're overheads and there's snare in there and stuff, I might want to add a little bit more top end to those if I'm going to boost anything. I don't think we need to boost anything in the low range, but definitely we could add some more brightness to our cymbals, make them shimmer a little more. So I'm going to go straight to a shelf this time. Oh no, let's have a look at, just, for argument's sake, what happens if we boost with a narrow Q. Let's have a listen.
World is sick, world is sick.
Instantly, we're getting some crazy stuff with those frequencies.
Free. Oh, no, pedals, they look
If I go real narrow,
good to me. And you're just
you'll just get weird things poke out. There's so many different frequencies you're dealing with a set of overheads. So you definitely want to use a shelf or something with a wide Q. Let's have a listen with this.
the way that you move should be, yet you're beautiful. Calorie news.
Instantly, we're just getting this nice, smooth boost of all the cymbals and the tops of the snare and the drums. Let's have a listen.
Disrespect, disrespect. Popping pills and posting pics, stressing on the wasting hips. My body's right, the world is sick, world is sick, world is sick. From flower to flower, growing free. Oh.
It's nice. I think that's really good. I don't think you'd need to do much more than that. Obviously, we can go through the rest of the drum tracks and remove some frequencies we don't want and whatnot, but that drum sound is really coming together. I don't think we need to go too aggressive on the stuff we've been working on, the kick, the snare, and the overheads. But just once again, because that's what we've been doing, let's go into that SSL channel and recreate what we did visually with this. Whoop, I don't want to do that. Get rid of that. So we had 208. Let's go 208 there. On that low. Over there, 713. Let's go 7.1. How many dB? 10 dB. Let's cut that. And a shelf. 3 kilohertz, 5 dB. 3 kilohertz, 4, 5.5 dB. So let's match that.
Your pedals, they look good to me.
Now, instantly, to me, that sounds better with the SSL EQ. It sounds just all together. But let's have a listen.
And you're just the way that you move should be, yet you're beautiful. Calorie.
So this is the SSL. Listen to that honkiness once we get rid of that EQ. And let's go to Cubase. Back to SSL. Back to SSL. So to me, the SSL has a bit more aggression in the highs. Is a bit more focused again. It has that more focused sound where the Cubase EQ is a bit more open. And I think it's just dependent on what you want to taste. Let's have another listen. Cubase. And I think the SSL actually has a bit more depth and dimension to it as well. It's interesting, the difference between the two EQs. I think once you've got a bit more going on information-wise, they sound drastically different with the same settings. So let's add that back in the mix. I think our drum sound, just with the kick, snare, and overhead EQ, is really coming together now. We've removed those frequencies we don't want. We've boosted the fundamental frequencies that we do want, and we're really sculpting that drum sound a little more. Let's now have a listen without any of those EQs. We'll cut all the EQ first. Then I'm going to add the SSL EQs.
You move so sweet, yet you're beautiful. Calorie news around the neck. Don't let up. Disrespect.
Add those EQs.
Disrespect. Popping pills and posting pics.
Take them off.
Stressing on the waist and hips. My body's right. The world is sick. World is sick. World is sick from flower to flower, growing free. Oh.
And I think that just shows obviously what we've done there. Without the EQ, it sounds boxy. It sounds like there's no clarity on those drums. The kick's a little lost in the mix. And as soon as we put those EQs back on, everything comes into focus. The low-mid boxiness is removed, and the drums become focused, but in a way that complements the mix. And I think that's really all we're ever trying to do when we're mixing. And that's the thing to keep in mind, is that at the end of the day, you want to remove those frequencies that are getting in the way of other instruments, and then you want to boost those frequencies that complement the instruments that you want. So those fundamentals. And, it's a bit of a, tricky concept to get at first. It took me a while really to understand it, as I think we all do. And, I think it's one of those things, as you train your ears, you start to hear it a bit more effectively, and you learn ways to craft the sounds that you want to get. But there's always exceptions to the rule. Sometimes you want boxiness in your kick drum. Think of any hip hop song, any sort of boom bap 90s hip hop song, it's got boxy kick drums. Or you might want something for effect where you need that boxiness. So it's entirely up to your own sort of design and what you want. You might want a boxier kick drum even on this track. It might be something you're going for. All I'm trying to show is some ways to get where you want to go. So, hopefully you liked this video today. If you haven't already, please hit like, please hit the subscribe. And if you've got any questions, definitely hit me up in the comment sections down below. I'd love to hear more feedback about these videos. Do you like the content that I'm putting out at the moment? Is there anything that you'd like to see me produce? Do you want more mixing stuff? Do you want more in-depth deep dives like this video? Do you want more tech reviews? Sort of what is it that you guys want to see me create in this channel, and what do you kind of want some answers on? I'd love to know where you guys are at and what you guys want to see. Yeah, but so far, the channel's starting to grow. Thanks so much to all of you that have already been subscribing and joining the channel. It's still early days, but hopefully I'm creating some stuff that you're all into. So yeah, hit like, hit subscribe. Definitely hit me up in those comment sections down below. I'm Mitch from the DIYRecordingstudio.com, and I'll catch you soon.